Helen married Raymond Briggs on a Saturday afternoon in June of 1987. She was 26 years old, and he was 31, and they got married in a small church in Dayton, Ohio, with 42 people in attendance, and a reception in the church hall afterward, with potato salad and sweet tea, and a 3-tier cake that Helen's mother had baked herself. It was not a grand wedding. Neither of them had the money for grand, but Helen did not care about grand. She cared about Raymond, about the way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, and the way he always held the door, and the way he looked at her, across the church hall that afternoon, like she was the only person in the room. She thought she knew everything about him. She was wrong. But that is the end of the story. The beginning is this. A 26-year-old woman, in a white dress, in a church hall in Dayton, Ohio, eating her mother's cake, and believing completely in the life she was about to build. They moved into a small house on Garfield Avenue, 3 weeks after the wedding. Raymond worked in logistics for a manufacturing company. Helen worked as a school administrator. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and they were careful with money, and they had a plan. Pay down the mortgage, save what they could, build something solid. The first years were good. Helen will tell you that honestly. The first years were genuinely good. Raymond was a steady man, not romantic in the way movies talk about romance, not given to grand gestures or surprise trips or flowers for no reason. But he was present. He came home for dinner. He fixed things when they broke. He showed up. In Helen's experience, showing up was rarer than people liked to admit, and she valued it more than flowers. They had 2 children, Dawn in 1990 and Marcus in 1993. Helen took 3 months off with each of them, and then went back to work, because they needed the income, and because she liked working, and because Raymond's mother watched the children during the day, and that arrangement suited everyone. The children grew up in the house on Garfield Avenue. They learned to walk in that living room. They went to school 3 blocks away. They had dinner together every night at 6:30. It was an ordinary life, and Helen was proud of it. Raymond's first company downsized in 2001. He was out of work for 8 months. Helen's salary carried them. She did not complain about this. She did not keep score. That was not how she thought about marriage. You carried each other. That was the whole point. He found another position in 2002, and things settled again. The children grew up and moved out. Dawn went to Cincinnati for college and stayed. Marcus went to Columbus and stayed. The house on Garfield Avenue got quieter. Helen and Raymond rattled around in it, in the comfortable way of people who have been married long enough to be easy in each other's silence. She thought she knew him. She was wrong. Raymond was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of 2018. He was 62 years old. Helen was 57. The doctor used words like aggressive and advanced, and Helen sat in the plastic chair beside Raymond's bed, and held his hand, and listened to every word, and did not cry until she was in the parking garage of the hospital, alone in her car, where she sat for 45 minutes before she felt steady enough to drive. She did not tell Raymond she had cried in the parking garage. She went home, and she made dinner, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table, and she said, "We are going to fight this." And he looked at her, with those eyes she had been looking at for 31 years, and he said, "I know we are." The next 2 years were the hardest of Helen's life. She drove Raymond to chemotherapy every Tuesday and Thursday. She sat in the waiting room with a book she never read, and a coffee that always went cold. She learned the names of every nurse on the oncology floor. She learned which anti-nausea medications worked and which ones didn't. She learned how to adjust the hospital bed they eventually installed in the living room, so that Raymond could be comfortable without disturbing the surgical site from his port. She learned things she never wanted to know, and she learned them because Raymond needed her to know them, and that was enough reason. She also kept working. She could not afford not to. Raymond's medical bills were significant, even with insurance, and Helen's salary was the stable income they could count on. She would work all day and come home and cook dinner, something light, something Raymond could tolerate, and then sit with him through the evening and help him to bed, and then do the laundry, or the dishes, or whatever needed doing before she went to sleep herself. She averaged 5 hours of sleep a night for nearly 2 years. Dawn came when she could. She drove up from Cincinnati on weekends and took over so Helen could rest. Marcus called every Sunday. The children were good. Helen is clear about that. The children were good, but they had their own lives and their own families, and the daily weight of it fell on Helen. She did not resent this, or if she did, she buried it deep enough that it did not surface. Raymond was her husband, 31 years. She was not going to leave him to face this alone. He died on a Tuesday morning in November of 2020. Helen was holding his hand. She had been holding his hand for most of the previous 3 days. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. Helen thought, peaceful is a word people use, because there is no better word. It was not peaceful. It was just over. She sat with him for a long time after. Then she called Dawn. Then she called Marcus. Then she called the hospice line. Then she went to the kitchen and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard. The yard Raymond had mowed every Saturday for 33 years. And she thought about all the Saturdays that were coming, that would have no one to mow it. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. Helen had not thought much about the will. Raymond had always handled the financial things, the investments, the insurance, the paperwork. Helen trusted him with all of it. 33 years of marriage, and she had never had reason not to trust him. She assumed the will would say what it had always said. Everything to Helen, and after Helen, to Dawn and Marcus equally. That was what they had agreed on years ago, when they had the wills drawn up. That was what made sense. Attorney James Cole had an office on the 3rd floor of a building downtown. He was a small, careful man, with reading glasses and a neutral expression, and he shook Helen's hand and Dawn's hand, and asked if they wanted water, and then sat down behind his desk and opened a folder. Helen sat with her hands folded in her lap. Dawn sat beside her. Marcus was on the phone. He had not been able to get away from work, and he was listening through Dawn's speakerphone. James Cole began to read. The house on Garfield Avenue. The house Helen had lived in for 33 years. The house where her children had learned to walk. The house she had cleaned and maintained, and paid the mortgage on for 3 decades, was to be sold. The proceeds were to be split. 50% to Helen. 50% to a woman named Patricia Weatherford. Helen did not understand what she had just heard. She asked James Cole to read it again. He read it again. Patricia Weatherford. An address in Louisville, Kentucky. No further description. No explanation. Helen looked at Dawn. Dawn was staring at the attorney with an expression Helen had never seen on her daughter's face before. Something between fury and disbelief, and something else that Helen could not name. On the phone, Marcus had gone completely silent. Helen said, "Who is Patricia Weatherford?" James Cole said, "I am not able to provide that information. I can only read the document as written." Helen said, "Was this the will we had drawn up together? The one from 2003? James Cole said, "This will was updated in 2019. Helen said, 2019. James Cole said, "Yes, March of 2019. Helen did her math quietly. March of 2019. 1 year after Raymond's diagnosis. 1 year into the chemotherapy. 1 year into the Tuesday and Thursday drives and the anti-nausea medications, and the hospital bed in the living room. 1 year into the 5 hours of sleep a night. He had updated his will in secret while she was driving him to chemotherapy." Dawn found Patricia Weatherford in 4 days. She was not a private investigator. She was a 34-year-old woman with a laptop and a fury that had not slept properly since the reading of the will, and she was determined. She found a Patricia Weatherford in Louisville, Kentucky, through a combination of public records and social media. She was 60 years old. She had worked for 30 years as an accountant. She had never been married. She had a daughter who was 32 years old. Dawn called her mother. Helen listened to everything Dawn said. Then she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How old did you say the daughter is?" Dawn said, 32. Helen did the math again. 32 years old. Born in 1991 or 1992. 1 year after Dawn. 3 years before Marcus. She did not say anything for a very long time. Then she said, "Do not contact her. Not yet." Helen hired a private investigator named Carl Webb. Carl was retired law enforcement. Methodical, expensive. She paid him with money from her personal savings account. money she had been putting aside for 30 years for emergencies. She told herself this qualified. Carl came back to her 3 weeks later with a folder of documents. He sat across from her at her kitchen table. The kitchen table in the house that was being sold, the house that was half hers and half a stranger's. And he laid out what he had found. Raymond Briggs and Patricia Ann Weatherford had met in 1990, the same year Dawn was born. They had maintained a relationship for nearly 30 years. Not continuous, Carl said. There were periods of no contact, but sustained. Patricia's daughter, her name was Renee, had Raymond listed as unknown on her birth certificate. But Carl had found financial transfers. Regular, going back 20 years. Raymond had been sending Patricia money every month for 20 years. Helen sat very still while Carl talked. When he was done, she thanked him. She paid him. She walked him to the door. She closed the door behind him. She went back to the kitchen table, and she sat down, and she looked at the wall for a very long time. 33 years. She had given him 33 years. She had carried his family and his illness and his death. And he had been carrying a secret the entire time that made everything she thought she knew about her life into something she no longer recognized. Helen contested the will. She hired an attorney, a different one, not James Cole, a woman named Sandra Osei, who specialized in estate disputes, and who told Helen clearly and directly what she was dealing with. The updated will was legal. Raymond had been of sound mind in March of 2019. The diagnosis had come that same month, but the will had been updated before the diagnosis was official. There were grounds to contest, but they were not strong grounds. The process would be long and expensive, and the outcome was uncertain. Helen said, "I want to try." The case took 14 months. It did not go the way Helen hoped. The will stood. The house on Garfield Avenue was sold in the spring of 2022. Helen received her 50%, enough to put a down payment on a small condominium on the other side of the city. She stood in the empty living room of the house on Garfield Avenue, on the last day, and looked at the walls where her children's heights had been marked in pencil, and then painted over, and then marked again, and she thought about 33 years of ordinary Saturdays and Tuesday dinners, and a man who had looked at her across a church hall, like she was the only person in the room. She does not know if he loved her. She thinks he did. She thinks he loved Patricia too. She thinks he loved Renee, in whatever way a man can love a child he has never met. She thinks he was a man who wanted too many things, and did not have the courage to choose, and so he chose nothing, and let the choosing happen after he was gone, when he could not see the damage. She is not sure that is better or worse than the alternative. She has stopped trying to decide. Dawn calls every Sunday now. Marcus calls on Wednesdays. Helen has a small garden on her condominium balcony, tomatoes and herbs, and one rose bush that took 2 seasons to establish itself properly. She tends it every morning before work. She has not remarried. She has not ruled it out. She has never contacted Patricia Weatherford. She has thought about it. She has picked up the phone. She has put it down. She does not know what she would say. She is not sure there is anything to say that would make any of it make better sense. She cleaned his house for 33 years. She raised his children. She drove him to chemotherapy every Tuesday and Thursday, and held his hand while he died. His will left half of everything to a woman she had never heard of. And the hardest part, the part she comes back to in the quiet of the mornings before the garden, and before the coffee, and before the day starts, is that she would do it all again, not because she was a fool, but because she loved him. And love, real love, the kind that lasts 33 years, does not come with a guarantee. It never did.